Hi, my name is Chad Hammer. I'm the invasive plant biologist with Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry's Natural Areas Program. My background is mostly forestry and forest ecology, and also invasive plant ecology and management. This presentation is on invasive plant ecology, their spread, and also invasion dynamics, with a large emphasis on why we should care about invasive plant invasion, or in other words, their impacts on the landscape. But before we get started, I wanted to quickly introduce the Maine Natural Areas Program. Again, we are within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And we ultimately help facilitate the conservation of Maine's biodiversity. And we do this by collecting, tracking, and providing data, and then sharing this data with multiple landowners, developers, resource managers, towns, state agencies, and other various conservation partners. We also do a lot of statewide invasive plant initiatives. Some of the data that we collect and the work that we do are on at-risk species, exemplary natural communities, wildlife habitat, ecological reserves, and invasive plants. So what is an invasive species? Well, according to the federal government, a lot of federal government agencies, they use the definition that of when a non-native species colonization can have large measurable impacts. This could be economic harm, environmental harm, and harm to human health. So we can see this when we think about this Japanese knotweed that landed on the shore of a river after a storm. And then a few years later, you see the whole bank just totally colonized by Japanese knotweed. You can argue that this is leading to environmental harm, economic harm, and probably even harm to human health with the reduction of water quality. And in Maine, we use a very similar definition. It also has just a very important distinction as well. So in Maine, we use a non-native species whose introduction causes economic or environmental harm or harm to human health, and which can establish and spread in minimally managed habitats. So for some examples here, we have knotweed growing along the Androscoggin River, and also some burning bush that you can see in late fall starting to turn red, which is primarily a garden escapee and really occupying this bank here of this forest, very minimally managed habitat, forest and wetland. So the good news is that not all non-native species become invasive. The number often depends on the taxa of organism, whether that's plants versus insects versus other animals and fungi, etc. For terrestrial invasive plants, this number is right around 1 to 5% of all introduced non-native plants introduced to North America. So looking at this image here, we see out of every 100 exotic species introduced to North America, about 10 become established. It might be slightly weedy, but only about one of them becomes invasive. So only about 1% can really establish in that minimally managed habitat and are very weedy. So how do invasive plants get here? This was a paper published about 10 years ago. It shows about 60% of these introductions were deliberate. And we see a couple different reasons for that. Most of it is horticulture, so up to 40% for horticulture purposes. 8% was brought here for livestock food, livestock forage and fodder. 4% were for conservation efforts. 7% were deliberate, but the reason was unknown. And then a small percent, 3%, were for medicinal value. And we also have some accidental introductions as well. This typically happens when a lot of plant propagules or seeds will contaminate different things, such as livestock or hay, packaging, or again, they come over in livestock, and also ballast on ships. They release their ballast water, a lot of different things. A lot of invasive species are in that. As far as horticulture is concerned, The same characteristic that makes plants desirable for horticultural reasons, such as they're pest resistant, good ground coverage out of these plants. They're colorful berries, so they're really attractive berries for different things that are spreading them. They have some of them may have a high tolerance for different types of habitats, maybe a salt tolerance. But ultimately, this really makes them successful invaders. And when we think about the conservation, some of these plants were planted deliberately for conservation efforts. This was really before we knew that they would cause damage in their new habitat, or we didn't really understand that they would outcompete our natives, and that would cause a lot of problems. But a lot of these plants were brought here and planted for maybe soil stabilization, bank and erosion control, often even sometimes wildlife food and wildlife habitat, and windbreaks and things of that nature. How do they spread? Well, once they're in North America, they're spread by seeds and fragments known as plant propagules. And the good thing is this can often be prevented. So it really takes a high level of mindfulness and really kind of being really deliberate in what we're doing. Some of these reasons are in equipment, a lot of forestry equipment, mowing equipment. A lot of these plant propagules and seeds are in different materials, such as hay, mulch, manure, fill, some gravel. Horticulture, again, is a big reason for a lot of these introductions and spread. We've talked a bit about that. We have a lot of plants coming in as hitchhikers and nursery pots. Recreationalists, so a lot of seeds will stick to pets, our gear, our boots. And also in the bottom right there, we see water, so newly constructed culverts. So we have some fill and material coming in, and also moving water, which is a vector for dispersing a lot of these seeds downstream. And also wildlife, same thing. There's wildlife and water. We can't do too much about it, but it's important to be aware of it and maybe keep an eye on our game trails, and also keep an eye on our streams and rivers, and kind of know where our parent populations and our seed sources are coming from upstream. Some best practices and things that we can do to prevent some of this. Monitoring sites. So again, kind of whenever we do any type of disturbance, or if we know there's a stream or river, make sure we're constantly monitoring. Monitoring our ATV trails, monitoring our skid trails, and monitoring our recent harvests. Use boot brushes. So whenever we are hiking or working in the woods, just carry along a little scrub brush when you're leaving the site, especially if that site has high invasive pressure, a lot of seeds in that soil. Make sure we're using boot brushes to clean off our boots. Clean equipment, maybe even request to have equipment cleaned before and after it's entering our sites. And also check our bodies. So when doing tick checks, looking for attached seeds to clothing, gear, and again, kind of monitoring all of these activities is a big way to prevent their movement. So why are they so successful? Well, they're very highly competitive. They have very aggressive growth, not only above ground growth, but also in their roots, so below ground as well. And this really allows them to create these very dense monocultures. As you can see in the top right there, that's a really dense monoculture of Japanese knotweed. And they also exhibit something called extended leaf phenology. So this is really in their genetic makeup, in their native ranges. They're really kind of their growing seasons are a bit longer than ours. So here in their native ranges, I'm sorry, their non-native ranges, they're leafing out very early in the growing season, before any of our natives, and they're really holding those leaves late in the growing season, much longer after our natives are all dormant. So you can kind of see in the bottom right there, that image there, that kind of pictogram. You could see the sun kind of in this understory. A lot of our natives have not leafed out yet, and these natives are already greening up and really capitalizing on all of those resources. And also the next one here, enemy release. So this is known as the enemy release hypothesis. This is just basically stating that these plants have escaped their enemies, their predators in their native ranges. And here in their non-native ranges, there's very little pests and pathogens that are really impacting these invasive species. So they have to allocate a lot less resources to defense, and therefore they can allocate these resources, more resources to um, abundant reproduction and also a very aggressive growth, so just more biomass. They're also able to make alterations to their habitat, which can negatively impact our natives, and it basically is better suited, the new environment is better suited for their growth. This is often done through allelopathic chemicals that are exuded from their roots, and really kind of, whether if it's just directly killing or impacting native tree regeneration, or knocking back our native fungal communities, which are a lot of our native plants depend on. And all of these reasons, again, making these invasive plants more efficient in resource use and putting a lot more resources towards reproduction and more biomass. And this is just an example of that extended leaf phenology. So this is a photograph of invasive honeysuckle in a forest understory in Augusta. And as you can see, this forest understory is already starting to green up when everything around it is still dormant. So again, these plants are photosynthesizing. They're taking up that water in that spring and taking all that sunlight, and really getting a huge advantage of our natives that are still basically sleeping at that point. So this extended leaf phenology equals a longer growing season, so increased ability to capture more resources and be very productive. The flip side is that this also makes for a great time to survey for invasive plants. So you can see them as they're leafing out before anything else, any of our natives. And it can also be a good time to manage for invasive plants, depending on the method that you're using. And here are just some examples of some very aggressive growth from some of our invasive plants. We can see some Oriental bittersweet overtopping some native trees and shrubs in Cape Elizabeth. And it's really reducing the photosynthetic capacity of these native trees that are just totally overtopped, causing a lot of leaf damage and also probably girdling those stems as well. And ultimately, probably exposing these native trees to more stressors such as pests and pathogens. It has to be stressing them out, making them more susceptible to other stressors. And on the left there, that's just some knotweed that I showed you before, that really dense canopy of knotweed. And you can see how bare, when that knotweed dies back, there's literally nothing else growing in it. And that is primarily because of that dense canopy. That knotweed is taking all the resources, but also knotweed is allelopathic, so exuding some allelopathic volatile organic compounds into that soil and really reducing regeneration of natives. And this damage from invasive plants is not always obvious. So as we can see on the left here, this is some bittersweet strangling some native trees. And once they're strangling like that, they'll cut into that cambium layer, into that outer bark, and really girdle the trees, and they'll die that way, and also create a lot of damage in their canopy as well. But again, it's not always obvious. In the case with garlic mustard and Japanese knotweed, those are two very common and highly allelopathic species that we have, where they really change that soil chemistry. In the case of garlic mustard, again, really killing or suppressing a lot of fungal communities in our soil, which is really damaging for a lot of our native species. So the take home here is that you really can't always see or understand the damage taking place with these invasive plants. Why do we care about invasive species? Well, for me, it always comes back to something similar to this quote by John Muir: if you talk on anything in nature, you'll find it connected to everything else. Ultimately, with invasive plants, they're outcompeting our native species, and this will over time lead to our native species being displaced, a reduction of native seed sources, a reduction of native regeneration, a reduction of our ecologically important trees, and therefore a loss of trees, a loss of functional diversity, and a reduction of biomass. This will then lead to ecosystem degradation. So we see a lot of changes to forest structure, a lot of changes to organic inputs, a lot of changes to reduction of biodiversity, and an increase in water temperature in our streams and rivers, and also an impairment to ecosystem services. So ultimately, that is very harmful for humans and life on Earth. We see a large impairment of ecosystem services that we really expect and we need from our healthy, functioning ecosystems. And just a couple examples here. We see a reduction in carbon sequestration because of that loss of biomass, a loss of habitat, loss of or poor water filtration ability, poor bank stabilizations, and erosion and flood control. Okay, it's time for a short break. And when we return, I'll talk about some specific examples of impacts and also discuss invasion dynamics. All right, so we have two pictograms here, and I'm just going to kind of talk about the take-home message of these really quick, just to introduce you to the concepts here. And the real big take-home here is that many native insects feed only on one plant species or a few closely related groups of plants or species. So ultimately, these insects have evolved to feed on one or two species of plants their entire life, and that's it. They don't utilize any other species other than these one or two species. So when a lot of these native plants are displaced with invasives, these insects just really don't have any food sources. And a lot of our insects have not evolved with these plants, so therefore they just don't utilize them. So on the left here, we can see where basically a moth or a butterfly will land on some of these specialized native plants and lay their eggs on these leaves, and these caterpillars will then hatch. And again, they've evolved over time to only feed on potentially this one species of plant. We may have this clutch of eggs hatching, and you may have 30 or 40 or maybe even more insect caterpillars or larvae on this plant, and you'll have birds basically coming and collecting these insects. On the right here, we can see where in the center we have insects, which is really the basis of the food web to get a lot of our fats and proteins into higher trophic levels, like birds, small mammals, even a little bit larger mammals like a raccoon, a lot of our amphibians, and then it's worked through higher trophic levels like our predators, fox, coyotes, bobcats, deer will feed on some of these. And really the base of that food web, or the take home, is that insects are the basis of that food web to get proteins and fats into higher trophic level animals. And the only thing that is feeding these insects are native plants. So as you think about it, the more our natives are displaced or the more invasives that you have in an ecosystem or a localized habitat, that's really going to negatively impact our insect populations. Just kind of highlighting the base of the food web there. And I would just like to pose a couple questions to the group. I just think it's helpful to think about our state bird, black-capped chickadee. For how many days are the young in the nest? And then for how many insects are needed to raise one brood of young? So when you have a clutch of eggs or a clutch of babies in a nest, how many insects do these parents need to find to successfully get their young out of the nest? And then just do the math on how many insects must chickadees find per day to raise their young. Okay, well the answer is the young are in the nest for 12 to 16 days. And these parents need to find roughly 6,000 to 9,000 insects in those 16 days to get these young successfully, to get them to survive and then fledge from the nest. And this is roughly 500 insects per day. So when you think about these birds flying around all day, spending a lot of energy trying to find insects in an area with a lot of invasive plants, they may not find nearly that many. And also, we're only beginning to understand the effects of the food web with a lot of our highly evolved and highly specialized insects. So here we have a couple examples of that. On the top left there, we have our highly specialized Luna moth, which these caterpillars are feeding on the foliage of walnuts, hickories, pecans, sweet gum, and sumac. And as these species are in decline, they're being displaced. There is no more food for the Luna moth. And again, the monarch butterfly is being negatively impacted by invasive plants. So these guys are highly specialized with milkweed. They lay their eggs on milkweed foliage, and the caterpillars and larvae hatch from the eggs, and they are feeding on milkweed foliage. But for some reason, I don't think it's quite understood yet, but black swallowwort which is very common in Maine, is for some reason these adult butterflies are tricked into thinking that they can lay their eggs on black swallowwort. But the problem is that the black swallowwort is not beneficial to the larva. It's actually killing the larva, and the moths. I'm sorry, the caterpillars and the larvae are not surviving on black swallowwort, so therefore they're never metamorphosizing into adult caterpillars. So black swallowwort is almost becoming a sink for monarch butterflies. It's also very damaging to physical habitat. So on the left here, we see a salt marsh, which is being overrun with common reeder Phragmites. This is close to Popham Beach State Park. And we have a lot of rare salt marsh birds that are really depending on these high salt marsh habitats. And as they are being displaced by Phragmites and some other species, maybe even some knotweed, we're really seeing a reduction of these salt marsh habitats. On the right there, we see a forest dominated by hardy kiwi in Rockland, Maine, which is kind of really similar to bittersweet. It really overtops a lot of our trees and shrubs. That really changes the habitat for a lot of our boreal mammals and birds and bats living in these habitats as well. So terrestrial invasive plants are also very detrimental to aquatic systems and water quality as well. And here's a couple examples here. A lot of these impacts are from my knotweed presentation, but you can say the same thing for any invasive plant that's creating very dense monocultures along streams and rivers. So what we see with a lot of knotweed or invasive plants is they create these very dense monocultures along these streams and rivers. We have a lot of bare exposed mineral soil, and plus less ground cover vegetation underneath these monocultures. So the combination of these two things leads to a lot of runoff, sedimentation, and erosion from our riparian areas and into our streams and rivers. This ultimately leads to a lot of embeddedness, so that's when a lot of silt will enter our streams and then settle out on our rock and cobble, which is really damaging for aquatic organisms. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. This runoff and erosion and sedimentation leads to a lot of bank stabilization issues. So we have a lot of bank collapsing into our waterways, which ultimately lead to poor water quality, a lot of excess nutrients entering into our water, and eutrophication events. So why is embeddedness important? Again, that's really when embeddedness is when a lot of that silt covers the rock and cobble. So we lose that really nice, clean rock bottom of our streams and rivers, which is super important for our trout habitat and a lot of our cold water fisheries. And the reason being is that, as you can see in the middle top there, these are very young fish fry, and they kind of will squirm into these crevices and cracks and really escape predation events from larger fish. And also their food, their primary food source, stoneflies and mayflies, highly depend on clean rock and cobble with almost no embeddedness. They really require that to live. And that is the number one food source for trout, these stoneflies and mayflies. So these high embeddedness, a lot of silt content on our stream beds is really bad for trout habitat and also the trout food as well. And when you think about physical habitat, over time, when we have these large banks, you can see on the top image there, this nothing but knotweed for probably 100 feet into that, 600 feet long by 100 feet wide of just knotweed. You have over time you have a reduction of our native trees, so no tree regeneration and very low structural complexity and diversity. Over time, this a reduction of trees will lead to a lack of coarse wooded debris. And coarse wooded debris is the reason why we have a lot of log jams and pools in our streams, which are really important. So less log jams and pools will over time will lead to less refuge for stream fish, less opportunity for sediment to settle out, and that is really important for water quality. So if the sedimentation never settles out, that's really bad for water quality, and less organic material storage. With a lack of coarse wooded debris, we see a less structural diversity and less habitat complexity, which reduces biodiversity. And reduced organic material into these streams and rivers, so less food resources for our aquatic organisms. And also a lot more solar radiation entering our streams. So when these dense monocultures form, our natives are outcompeted and tree regeneration is severely reduced. So this has large impacts to the shading ability of the vegetation along our streams and rivers. It's ultimately more solar radiation entering our stream, which is really bad for water quality and fish habitat. All right, these next couple slides here, this is more on invasion dynamics and what kind of allows these plants to grow very quickly in certain areas and most areas. As you may or may not know, a lot of these invasive plants really depend on open areas or bare soil. And then it's also further influenced by the proximity to parent populations or seed sources to these open areas. So that I made the slide to kind of show that relationship. Well, I kind of jumped the gun a little bit. Invasive plants are often introduced to the landscape by development and modifications. So whether that's kind of clearing a field for agriculture or timber harvesting or putting in a culvert and really kind of creating these open areas for different land use and disturbance events. That again, combined with open areas, allows these plants to not only be introduced but also establish on the landscape. And then if they're have close proximity to a seed source or a parent population, that can get out of control very quickly. So when you have these open areas and a parent population or a seed pressure there, maybe you have some honeysuckle growing in a timber harvest and you clear that area, that honeysuckle is just going to take off really fast, like you see here in the middle. And then it's further spread throughout the landscape by natural processes, so moving water, wildlife, and further development modifications, land use, and disturbance on the land. And just a bit about the role about disturbance. So all plants really kind of have these ecological barriers that are restricting their colonization or their abundance on the landscape. So we have a parent population on the left here, and it cannot get its seeds or its propagules to the sink or the invasion site on the right because of these ecological barriers. Now, these barriers can come in the form of biological barriers, maybe they're poor dispersers or poor competitors, physical barriers such as buildings or strip malls or mountains, dense forests or development, or maybe even environmental barriers such as low light or poor soil conditions. But what disturbance really does is really removes these barriers from the landscape. So it maybe it can facilitate dispersal. It breaks down physical barriers such as dense forests if we clear a forest or development. It also changes the environmental conditions as well, so allowing these plants to overcome light barriers and soil conditions. So just making the point that whenever you have disturbance, that really ramps up the likelihood and the intensity of invasion. This is just kind of an example of that. So this was something that I observed um, late winter. I found I was driving, taking a different way home, and I saw this looked like to be a pile of fill that is occupied by knotweed. And then knotweed kind of going off the bank to the right there. You can see those dead kind of stems. And down that bank is a beautiful salt marsh. So again, I kind of first found this example in late winter, and I didn't really understand, or I was just kind of asked myself the question: well, what came first, the pile of fill or the knotweed on the bank? Did the knotweed on the bank colonize the bare soil of the fill, or did the knotweed come in on the fill and then colonize the bank? Both very highly likely scenarios with invasive plants. But the truth of it was that none of them were true, because when I drove by it in the spring, um, I actually saw that on the fill pile, that's actually giant knotweed. And what's downslope on the bank there is Japanese knotweed. So two totally different species. Giant knotweed just basically gets twice as tall. It has much larger leaves. So currently the giant knotweed on that fill pile is about 18 feet tall. And it's really unfortunate because all behind those trees there, on the other side of all those trees and down this slope, is a very beautiful salt marsh in Bath. But you can see here where it's obvious somebody just dumped this fill pile contaminated with giant knotweed. So what can we do about invasive plants? Well, just some key steps to addressing invasive plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in our prioritization of management and making recommendations. But the biggest thing that we can do is prevent new introductions. And again, that comes down to a lot of those good practices. So monitoring, being aware of dispersal agents, monitoring disturbed areas, using boot brushes, cleaning our equipment, things like that. We can identify the plant, properly identify, assess the infestation, and report it. We can prioritize and control and monitor and repeat. And again, we'll talk a bit about that, more about that later. But I did want to introduce this concept here of early detection, rapid response. So when you think about um, preventing new infestations, this is really the reason why. And I can't speak enough about why that's important. But hopefully this graph will kind of get you thinking about that. So on the y-axis here, we see area infested. On the x-axis, we see time. And on the right-hand y-axis, we see control cost. So as time goes on, area infested goes way up, control costs go way up, and success ahead really becomes impossible. So if you can catch your invasion very early on, when that species shortly after it's introduced, as you can see here, I'm going to see if I can use this laser pointer maybe. As you can see, if you catch it early, prevention. So the first step is prevention. If something does establish, if you catch it early, eradication is still possible. But as time goes on, area infested increases, eradication quickly becomes no longer possible, and you're more into containment or asset-based protection and long-term management. So when you think about this, you know, maybe for bittersweet, we're more, bittersweet's been here for a while, time has gone on, the area that bittersweet occupies is pretty high. Control costs are through the roof to control bittersweet. And we're really, eradication is no longer possible with bittersweet. We're really more looking at long-term management or protecting our assets. So protecting our power lines, our phone lines, things like that, infrastructure. Where if you catch it early, you can still eradicate it. Control costs are very low, and you can be very successful. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure, as they say. As far as reporting it goes, IMAP Invasive is a great resource to do that. If you have something very uncommon or you have questions, you can report it to me directly at chad.hammer@maine.gov. Um, or you can report it using IMAP Invasive. So we just recorded a couple of tutorials for that. for the Invasive Plant Academy, and that should show you how to do that. And again, for some of these more early detection rapid response areas or species, you can report an IMAP invasives and also follow it up to an email, again, to myself or invasives at mnap, invasives.mnap@maine.gov. And that's it for this presentation. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you're getting something out of these presentations. And again, if you have any questions, you can always call me or email me at chad.hammer@maine.gov. Thank you.